Hi, my name is Allison and welcome to my Elder Gal journey. All of us experience grief at some point in our lives, often multiple times in our lives, myself included. But I'm also a master's level therapist with a degree in counseling psychology, and I worked for a number of years as a bereavement counselor. If you're watching this, you're likely dealing with grief, and you've probably heard of the 5 stages of grief at some point. And I'm sure you have questions about it, or you're wondering why your pattern of grieving is not fitting those 5 stages exactly. So I'm going to go into that in this video. I'm going to talk about the 5 stages briefly. I'm going to go through them, but I'm also going to discuss how much they actually do apply to what I would consider the generic grieving process. In other words, the typical grief that we go through in life. So the 5 stages of grief, which I'm sure you're familiar with to some degree, are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And I'll just give a little scenario so you can better understand how they typically work, at least how they were designed. So if you went to your doctor and your doctor tells you that you have 6 months to live, you have an incurable disease, then these 5 stages would probably pretty accurately relate to what your experience will be. So the first would be denial. Your doctor tells you you're not going to live more than 6 months, and you're going to be in shock, surprise. You're going to say, I don't understand that. I don't feel that bad. How can I be dying? And that could last for a few days. It could last a little longer than that, but at some point you will transition out of that. And the next stage that you could go into is anger. And anger basically is where you're going to say, well, I don't understand how I could be dying. I've eaten right, I exercise all the time, I take care of myself. How could I be dying right now? And that would lead to this feeling of anger, which again would be relatively short-lived, but could last a few days or even a week or two. At that point, you might transition into what we call bargaining. And bargaining is much more likely if you're a person of faith. You believe in God, you believe in a higher power. And at that point, you're going to say, please just, let this not be true. Let me live for a while longer. Even if I'm going to die, give me a couple of more years. Let me see my grandchildren get married or graduate from college or whatever it is you want to bargain for. At some point, whatever your belief system, you're going to bargain for whatever, feels appropriate to you. And then after those stages, you go into depression. And depression typically lasts longer than the other stages, probably combined. Depression is becoming hopeless, sad, lethargic. You don't really want to do anything. You don't even want to see people you care about. And you cry a lot. Maybe if you do talk to people, you're always talking about, your worst fears and anxieties about what's going on with you. Again, depression is probably the most common stage for most people. And then if you get through that, especially if you're facing your own death, you hopefully get to a stage we call acceptance. And acceptance means that you have accepted what's happening to you and you're okay with it. And I used to speak to the nurses that worked at hospice when I was a bereavement counselor, and they often told me that most patients did reach acceptance. They might reach it a few weeks before they die, and they might not reach it till a few minutes before they die, but that most people did reach acceptance. So that's the 5 stages and how they were originally designed. And in a minute, I'm going to go into talking about what the origins of those stages were, and then how much they do or do not apply to what I would consider everyday grief. But before I do that, please, if you would, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel in order to support my channel. Thank you. So the origins of the 5 stages of grief came from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote about them in her 1960s book on death and dying. And she specifically applied them to people that were facing their own death. Now, this has been very controversial since that time because they ended up reaching a broader audience and basically being advocated for in terms of all kinds of grief. Now, the reason I know that bothered Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who came up with it, is because in the year 2000, I was in my graduate school studies, and I interviewed a nun, a Catholic nun, who was a very good friend of hers. And at the time, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was living only a few miles away from where I was in Tempe, Arizona. And the nun told me that in the interview that one of the things that had always bothered Elizabeth a lot was that the 5 stages of grief were used for just any type of grieving. They weren't used for what she had originally created them for, which was in discussion of people facing their own death. So I thought that's important to state that. A lot of people don't know that about her. She was very ill for the last few years of her life, and she ended up dying in 2004. But it did upset her that the stages of grief were used for basically, or stages of dying were used for stages of grief. So how well do these stages actually fit what I would consider typical grief or generic grief? They fit in some ways and they don't fit in others. I mean, I guess that's the short answer. The long answer is that it depends on the person. There are people I've seen who are grieving that basically go through all 5 stages. They may not go through them in order. They may cycle back around to different stages, but they have experienced all 5 stages. I would say it's more normal for people who are grieving to experience probably 3 out of the 4 or 3 out of the 5 stages. Most people experience depression. Most people experience some denial, especially in the beginning when something has just happened. And most people do experience some anger at some point. It may be short-lived or it may be repetitive anger that comes up over time. The other stages, the bargaining and the acceptance, I think are less likely for what I would consider everyday generic grief. So the stages are a helpful tool to make us think about what we're going to go through when we're grieving, but I don't necessarily think they're applicable to all types of grief. So let me give you an example of that. If you lose your job and you needed a job, you're going to grieve, okay? You're going to have denial at first because you're in shock. You don't realize maybe you were totally surprised by losing your job. You got laid off or you got fired and you didn't expect it. And you might be angry. I would think it's very likely you would get angry. You'd get angry with your boss who fired you, or maybe the company itself, or whatever. So there's going to be some anger. There may even be some bargaining there. You may, especially if you're a person of faith, you may say, please, I need a job fast, please, every day maybe you pray for a new job. So I would say there was bargaining. Depression, there's definitely going to be, because at some point, unless you get another job right away, you're going to be worried about and anxious about what's happening to you. And you may get to the point you even stop trying. You just sit at home in your pajamas on the couch, watching something on the internet. So you may basically give up at some point. Not everyone does, but you might do that. And there may or may not be acceptance. It depends on if you get another job, you probably can move on. And you may be able to accept that happened for you. So you might go through all 5 stages of that, but I think what's different about it is you're probably going to keep cycling into various things. Like you may alternate a lot of anger and depression. The same thing would happen, let's say you're going through a divorce. Usually there's a lot of anger around a divorce when somebody leaves you, or especially if you've been together a long time. You'll be angry, you'll be depressed at various times. There might be less bargaining in that instance, depends on, again, your belief system, but I would say there's definitely a lot of anger and definitely a lot of depression. And acceptance may or may not come. I've met people that have been divorced for 10 years and never totally accepted and really moved on from that. So that shows you how different things that cause us to grieve may affect us differently, and we may experience the stages differently. And so because of that, I prefer to view these stages really as cycles of grief. That's kind of the term I use myself, is that you're going to cycle through different emotions when you're grieving. And there may even be things you experience that aren't in these 5 clear-cut stages. So it's important to be open-minded about what you could experience in grief. When I used to do bereavement counseling, I had clients ask me, why aren't I in bargaining yet? Or why aren't I in depression? Like there was a timeline to it. No, there isn't a timeline to it. Anything you're experiencing, any emotion you're feeling is what's valid in the moment. It's what you're going to be feeling. And it may not keep to a timeline or a schedule or a stage. It's going to be different cycles of grief. So I hope that's helped explain this a little more and explain why I talk about, what's fact and versus fiction about the stages of grief, and hopefully that sheds some light on it for you. In the coming videos, I'm going to be sharing more topics related to grief and navigating grief. So please stay tuned and watch for the next video. Thanks for listening.